I know leaf blowers are typically meant to do hard work cleaning up the yard, but this one has a pretty good reason why it's not able to do that. Besides that, even if it did start and run, I doubt you're going to get any real work done with it, but it's still better than the alternatives. But if you have to make do with what you've got, then we better get to work because this one is going to take some time. In today's video, we're going to be looking at this very simple leaf blower from Weed Eater. And the problem is that the pull rope is stuck, so we're not able to test start it before we try and fix it. If all possible, I like to make sure that the engine starts and runs on the projects I work on before we put time and money into them. Otherwise, you might be making an investment into a project that's not going to go anywhere. So after looking at the machine, there is a zip tie fix on it, but to be honest, I kind of like it, but we might have to change that later on. The fuel lines are completely missing, so we'll have to fix that once we look at the recoil. Now at first, I thought the rope was just stuck, however with the harder pull, it started to come out. That means the engine is not stuck, which is a huge relief, but after pulling on the rope again, it started to get stuck once again. So what this means is that we have a very strange problem with the recoil, and we'll have to inspect it to see why. After looking at the fuel cap, it turns out the check valve is missing from it, which means fuel will be able to leak out of the cap. I'm not too worried about it, since it's highly unlikely you'll have this machine upside down. But if the blower should tip over on its left side, there could be a fuel leak. We'll worry about that later on. Right now, we need to get to the recoil assembly, and to do that, we'll need to take off both of the housings. With the housing off, we'll then take off the impeller, and to do that, I'll use my impact. You don't need to use one, but you need to find a way to keep the impeller still or lock up the engine. And with it gone, we can then take off the bolts holding the upper housing to the engine, and that's where we'll find the recoil assembly. And if you noticed it, as soon as the recoil was loose from the engine, the rope retracted back into the assembly. Now it's not perfect, but it seems to be working a lot better than it ever did before. So what do I think is going on here? Well, I think the plastics for the engine is rubbing on the pulley. And that's because without the engine on the housing, the pull rope seems to work just like it should be without any binding. While looking at the rope, I can see that it's beginning to show signs of wear, and this would be a great time to replace it. And to replace the rope, it's actually pretty simple. We'll just pull out all of the rope from the pulley and then lock the pulley from spinning. Now because of the type of clamp that I'm using, I'm not very happy with how secure it is, so I'll just use this piece of wood to help out. Next, we'll take out that screw that anchors the end of the rope and then work the rope loose and then measure out a slightly longer one. It is kind of risky making the rope too long as it may not all fit on the pulley, so we're only going to make it just a tiny bit longer. Basically, the original rope might be about 4 feet long, but we're only going to make the new rope about 8 inches longer. Luckily, we can just cut the end of the rope on the handle side if we end up with too much rope. I will admit, this has to be one of the strangest ways to anchor the rope around a pulley, but I don't want to attempt a different way. Now I'm quite sure some have tried doing it differently, but I've never come across one. Once the slack is out of the rope, we can then replace the screw at the end to anchor it. No need to use a thread locker, but just don't overdo it, otherwise this repair is going to get a lot tougher. After making sure the recoil was working well, we'll then take a good look at the pulley, and that's when we see the rubbing marks on it. What that means is that the housing for the engine is probably making contact with it, so how do we fix it then? I guess we could try to clearance the housing or the pulley, or we can try to add some space between them. And to do that, I'm going to put these washers between the housing and the recoil, and hopefully this fixes it. So at first, I thought about gluing them to the posts on the engine side, but it was much easier to just rest them on the recoil side. Yes, I could have glued them on here as well, but I didn't want to add even more time to this project just for curing. We'll then carefully place the engine back onto the upper housing, trying not to move the washers, and then replace the bolts. And before we continue with the reassembly, we're going to test out that recoil, and sure enough, it's working like it should be, so our theory was right. That means we can finally close up this side of the blower and move on to testing whether or not the engine will even start and run. If it does, we can then move on to the fuel system, but if it doesn't, we'll have to figure out why and decide if it's worth continuing. Now, if this was a higher quality machine from a better brand, the recoil would have been really easy to get to. So a lot of experienced consumers would just avoid this style of blower because of the recoil that's on here, and you really can't blame them either. But there is one thing to consider though, and that is how often are you going to need to service the recoil? And the second point is, will it be you or someone else who's going to work on it? Next up, we'll put some fuel into that carb and then use the recoil we just fixed and see if it starts and runs. Now that we know that the engine can start and run, we just need to look at the carb and see if there's anything wrong with it. Unfortunately, the carb seems to be stuck to the engine, so we'll have to get a bit aggressive with it. Just be aware that the gasket between the carb and the engine might be stuck on the engine, or in this case, the gasket is stuck to the backside of the carb. This gasket is extremely important to how the carb works, and without it, the engine may not even start. Now the purge bulb might not be broken, but it might be just one press away from breaking, so we'll replace it later on. After taking off the pumping side of the carb, we can see the pumping diaphragm, and this is exactly how it should look. But if those two flaps are bent, then this diaphragm might need to be replaced. Looking under it shows a remnant of the old fuel that somehow isn't stuck to anything, which makes for easy cleaning. There's also a strange dry pile of some kind of debris, which is probably from the ethanol fuel that dried up in here. I guess this is what it looks like when you don't introduce fuel to the carb, which makes it really easy to clean. Next up, we're going to take off this metal plate to expose the metering diaphragm, whose job it is to control fuel flow through the carb. It needs to be extremely flexible like a cotton t-shirt, and if it's not, it'll affect how the carb works. And to get a better idea, we're going to separate it from the plate, and this is when we find out why this carb wasn't going to work anyway. And as you just heard, this metering diaphragm is somewhat petrified and is way beyond usable, so we're going to need to replace it. But before we do that, we're going to spray down this carb and get as much of that old fuel and dirt out of the carb as possible. This might take a couple of minutes, or you can take as much time as you want, just don't be stingy with the cleaner. We're also going to take out that needle and rocker arm, that way we can clean the screen from the backside as well. Just be careful because these tiny parts are very easy to lose, and if you do, you have a challenging time finding them. While cleaning the carb, you want to make sure that the cleaner can pass through the screen, and if it doesn't, then focus your cleaning there. Ours is doing that, so we'll move on to cleaning the pumping section, and once that's clean, we'll then start to put the carb back together. I do have to admit, this is a lot of detailed work that most consumers are not willing to deal with, so most just order a new carb instead. This particular carb is nothing special, so replacing it with a cheap aftermarket one shouldn't be an issue. Once you get the needle and rocker arm back into the carb and secured, check and make sure it's working like it should be, otherwise you'll have to do it again. So I am going to reuse the gasket for the metering diaphragm, except this time we have a new one to replace that petrified one. So you can buy just the diaphragms, you don't have to buy an entire rebuild kit just to get it. I can recall years ago that I would buy these kits and only use the metering diaphragms, which is kind of silly to be honest. But now that I know you can just buy them separately, that's what I do 99% of the time. The purge bulbs can also be purchased by themselves too, so there's really no need to buy an entire kit unless the carb is just really that bad. Next up, we're going to replace the fuel lines, but we could save some money by reusing the fuel filter. However, if it looks questionable, then I would just replace it. This one looks to be in great condition, so we're going to reuse it, but you should probably clean the inside of it the best you can before using it. The first line I'll be installing is the longer fuel filter line, but you're welcome to run the return line first. Once the filter is installed, make sure that it sits near the front of the fuel tank. That way, it'll be able to pick up all the fuel it can, otherwise the runtime will be very short. So it turns out that the openings in the fuel tank are two different sizes, which means the other fuel line is smaller in this case. There's nothing wrong with having a return line that's smaller than the filter line, it just makes it a bit more interesting to replace. And just as a reminder, the return line can be as long as you want it to be, but I recommend it being at least an inch long to keep it from backing out. So when connecting the fuel lines, the filter line will connect to the port further away from the bulb, while the return line will connect to the one closer to it. Now before we continue with the repairs, I like to stabilize the carb and put some fuel into the tank so we can test the flow through the system. While pressing on the purge bulb, fuel will come up the filter line, enter the carb, fill the bulb, and then leave the carb through the return line and go back to the tank. And as you can see, fuel is flowing the way that it should be, and as you can tell, the fuel was also dark at first, which is what came out from that used filter. It doesn't happen that way very often, but that's why it's so important to clean a used bulb before using it. And finally, we'll properly install the carb with its gasket, then replace the air filter and its cover, then try starting the blower. Well, it works and it even runs okay, but I don't think this blower's got much more to give. That's the problem with these undersized, underpowered leaf blowers. They really can't do too much, and if you try, hopefully you got time to burn. Because if you intend on using this on your lawn full of leaves, I think you'd be better off just using a rake. I like power tools just as much as the next person. I just don't like wasting my time on a machine that's only good for clearing my porch of leaves. So my question is, would you consider taking this blower off my hands if I gave it to you for free? Because I really doubt that anyone's going to buy this from me, and if they did, they must be really desperate. Thank you for watching. I really do appreciate your time here. Please feel free to ask me any questions about this project or about your own projects, and I hope to see you in the next video.